So, this is a book report on The Income Tax Root of All Evil by Frank Chodorov. And so, this book was written in 1954. So, it is a bit of a dated book, but I think that it really prophesies what's going on in America today. The book discusses how the income tax has started and has been the cause of majority of America's modern corruption and oligarchy, and has caused a downward spiral of the republic. And it comes from the perspective of what is called the old right, which is a precursor to the paleo conservatives. And in essence, they oppose communism and promote classical liberalism and social conservatism and more isolationist understandings of American foreign policy. So, before we begin, some preliminary info. The author of the book, Frank Chodorov, was highly influenced by the economist Henry George and the Georgist movement of the 1890s. He read Progress and Poverty, which was Henry George's book, and this system says the only morally acceptable tax is a tax on land value. This is the single tax system and is close to how America used to be funded in the 1780s. So, basically, how that works is there's a tax on the land and not what is built on the land because it is seen that God made the land, we did not. So we can have land as a private property, as a personal property, but since we're not the ones that made it, it can be taxed. Everything else is made by land. So natural resources are taxed, but not the production or how we profit off of that land. And so, why this book? We have a president currently who wants to return America to an income tax less economy and to use tariffs. And this is how America was originally funded: was tariffs and through taxing products. So, and also, how should Christians view the income tax? So there's a couple of key vocabulary words that need to be understood before we can continue. One is, what does ability to pay mean? Ability to pay principle holds that those with more income and wealth should pay more taxes. So that's a key one that's going to be brought up a lot. A levy is just a tax or a fee or a fine. An excise tax is a tax on goods, so a tax on products that are produced. Inalienable rights are personal rights held by an individual which are not bestowed by law, custom, or belief, and which cannot be taken or given away or transferred to another person. A more conservative understanding of this is that the laws are given by God and not by the government or the people. Personal property is ownership of an object without the intent to profit, and private property is the ownership of an object with an intent to make a profit. And a bond is an investment product where individuals lend money to a government or company at a certain interest rate for an amount of time. So the first chapter of the book, Solomon's Yoke, talks about First Kings chapter 12, wherein Jeroboam, the evil king, imposes a harsh yoke upon the people, and this is interpreted as a heavy, heavy income tax. So Jeroboam was the evil king. He increased the income tax more than the people could bear. They couldn't enjoy the fruits of their labor, and this was because Jeroboam wanted control and power over the people. Rehoboam, his successor, was petitioned by Israel to remove this yoke. And so the book posits from the biblical witness that the current American income tax is immoral based off of this witness. So, politically speaking, what is evil? This is the next chapter of the book. And it talks about how within the Christian, this book talks a lot about the Judeo Christian tradition. And I will posit that this is not part of the Judeo-Christian, or there's no such thing as a Judeo-Christian tradition. There's Judaism and there's Christianity, which have two separate uh, moral systems. Um, the book posits that the Ten Commandments is the judge of what is good, and this is because Frank Chodorov is a secular Jew, so he's going to be more willing to see that Judeo-Christian values exist, because he comes from the perspective that Christianity is not true. Whereas we would come from the perspective that the Christian tradition is true. And so he posits that the American tradition, which is rooted in Christian morality, Judeo-Christian morality, holds that all political evils violate natural rights. Um, so these are rights given to us by God. The American people have generally seen the Constitution to be a judge of what is good politically speaking. So the Constitution and specifically its amendments have been seen as the guardrails for how do we protect people's inalienable rights. And this book posits that the 1913 16th Amendment violates the original intent of the Constitution and the natural rights given by God, specifically the right to property. And so the next chapter, yours is not your own. So, it talks about how there is indirect taxes, which are taxes that are on the price of goods. So, basically, indirect taxes are any tax that don't directly tax your labor and the product of that, which is your income. And so, and there's direct taxes which do that. They are taxes directly upon personal property and income. And in doing this, the government says you do not own all of your labor. The government, and there's a quote. Um, so the government arbitrarily sets down the amount of your own income you are allowed to keep. The amount you're allowed to keep depends solely upon the needs of the government, and you have nothing to say about it. So this is the 16th Amendment. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and with regard to any census or enumeration. If the US government wanted to, they have the complete legal right to take 100% of your income. This is the road to communism. So this is how we can get to a system of the redistribution of wealth, which we are already there with the welfare state. And except the system, the money is not moving from the rich to the poor. So unlike in the Bolshevik Revolution, they didn't kill all the rich and take their money and redistribute it and take everybody's money and redistribute it equally among the people. In fact, it is moving into the pockets of the politicians and the rich. So the richer keep getting richer and the poorer keep getting poorer. And so, as long as the confiscation of property is legalized, this country is not immune to the advent of ultimate socialism, which is communism. So, the Virginia Declaration of Rights says that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And what is contained in the United States Constitution, the preamble that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is a summary of this. This is what was originally intent by the Constitution. And so, but there's a quote from the book. But while just wanting to live gives the individual a title to life, it is an empty title unless he can acquire the things that make life livable, beginning with food, raiment, and shelter. These things come to you because of labor. And so if you need labor to live, and you don't want to labor in order to labor, you want to labor in order to meet your needs. And so since labor is required to meet your needs and you need property to meet your needs, then since life needs property, property is a right to life, which means you have a right to your property and labor given to you by God as a necessity. So this is the next chapter, how it came upon us. The people who are remonstrated so vigorously over a measly tea tax could hardly have understood the idea of letting their pockets be picked. You have to remember that the American Revolution was fought mainly over taxes. So the original 1789 Constitution only allowed for tariffs and excise tax or tax on goods. And this was because you don't have to buy objects. So let's say there's a tax on pies or a tax on vegetables. You don't necessarily need to buy the pies and you don't necessarily need to buy the vegetables, but it's up to you on what you're going to spend your money on. And so it is a lesser evil to have an excise tax than to have an income tax. Because hypothetically, you could grow your own food. And so originally, the Fed was supposed to be the foreign department representing the states. The states are individual nations that are united in a loose bond around common values that are seen under the Constitution. This is sort of like the modern EU, except under the idea of individual liberties are given by God. And so during the Civil War, the first step towards our current predicament was the issuing of war bonds. They had a limited outline by the Constitution that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportionment to the census or enumeration herein before directed be taken. This is Article 1 of the Constitution. And so how does that work? So 1862, Lincoln instituted the first income tax, and this is necessary in order to fund the Civil War. And they mixed bonds with the income tax because since a bond is an IOU, it is limited to how much revenue the Fed can bring in. And so the bonds were linked to help the government um, since the government was limited on its ability to tax, the bonds were basically stealing from future citizens their income and bringing it to the present. So it's a loan from the citizens. So the government borrows on its ability to tax because taxes are IOUs taxes are its only source of revenue, the only security it has to offer the lender. And so this first income tax during the Civil War was a flat rate of 3%. But this was not enough to fund the war. So a switch to an ability to pay system occurred. The Lincoln administration arbitrarily declared its income levy as an excise tax, and the Supreme Court upheld this perversion of language and a decision rendered in 1868. So Lincoln tried to pass this income tax as a tax on goods through understanding the bonds and the ability to pay system. So what the ability to pay system? The ability to pay doctrine proceeds from a direct violation of this principle of equality. It establishes a legal classification of society. It sets up a principle of government that was not contemplated when this nation was formed. It is a reversion to the caste system that had existed in Europe. And why is it a reversion to the caste system? Because it says that some people's incomes are worth more than other people's incomes. And um, so this ability to pay system says that advocates of the ability to pay system do not distinguish between wealth obtained by production and wealth obtained by privilege. And since majority of people um, gain their money through the ability or the through production rather than privilege, when we tax people, it disproportionately affects the lower classes than does the upper classes. And so this ability to pay system then discourages production of wealth for the lower and middle classes because men work to satisfy their desires, not to pay taxes. So, like, if you're getting taxed at 20% of your income, then somebody who makes $40,000 a year, but so now you're really only taking home, let's say, 35,000 roughly, let's say, that's going to disproportionately affect you than somebody who makes $1 million and is taxed at 50 to 60%, but still takes home over $100,000 a year. They're still way better off than you are. So this affects the lower and middle classes than it does the upper classes. So the effects on this tax is not it is not a tax on income, it is a tax on capital. And why is that? So the way that we are able to generate capital is that, and this is another quote from the book. It says, "If we examine the income tax carefully, we find that it is not a tax on the income so much as a tax on capital. What the government takes from me is not what I consume, but what I might have saved. To be sure, I might have spent some of it on a new suit or to paint my house, but some of it I might have put in the bank, where it would have been available at interest to someone who would have used it to build a new factory, enlarge his plant, open a store, buy a farm. And that's what generally happens on savings. Hence, the effect of income taxation is to impair the capital structure of the country." And so when you look at this, the majority of the rich have their money not in the bank, not open to be borrowed by somebody else, but it's already invested in other capital structures. So you take Elon Musk, for example, as one man, one of the most highly successful men on the planet. He already has most of his money invested in his company. So these are most of his investments are not they're not going to be able to be liquid within a year. And so it's not going to be available for people who want to build something right now. And so what happens is this cripples our country's ability to invest in its people, specifically in the lower and middle classes. So eventually the government takes all of this money from the people. So if on average it's taking 20 to 50% from the middle to the lower class, it's going to have to, because the people do not have the ability now to save their money, it's going to have to take a lot of that money and give it back to the people, but inefficiently. So eventually, the government will have to subsidize the missing capital it stole, and this leads to socialism. When all the capital is under the hands of the government, you must work under their terms, and that is slavery. So you must, for example, with food stamps, you must buy what the government wants you to buy. So there's specific items in the food stamp that are approved. You couldn't, if you wanted to, go and buy whatever you wanted. And that's just a very small example. Um, but the more and more and more this happens, the more that this encroaches on people with in the middle class and lower classes. So eventually, uh, it could get to the point where it's like, well, you don't need that computer, or you don't need to open that business, or you don't need to build that building. The government will have the say in what you can do. And we see this already happening in America with the zoning laws that and all of the red tape that you have to go through to build whatever you want to build. And so this is the next chapter, the Revolution of 1913. Income taxation appeals to the governing class because in its everlasting urgency for power, it needs money. Income taxation appeals to the mass of people because it gives expression to their envy. It's so you in understanding that in a purely capitalistic system, and you see this in the late 1800s, you have more and more people gaining wealth through capital and investment in capital, and now you have the income inequality of the top 0.01% make 50% of the money. They have 50% of the capital in America, and the bottom percent have way less. And so there's an inequality in the quality of life of people. That's ultimately what people are become envious of. And so politicians capitalize on that. And instead of putting more money into the hands of the people, they take it away from them and put it into their own pockets through income taxes. And so the sum of all their arguments for income taxation comes to political ambition and the sin of covetousness. And from the Civil War to 1913, there was a social pushes to curb the problems of industrialization that put more power in the Fed. And this culminated in 1913 with the pass of the 16th Amendment. And so, with the advent of the income tax and infinite free handouts from the Fed, the government can now buy votes, and a republic has come to an end. If you can promise the people that you will take care of them, you will win their vote. And this is because the people are struggling. Um, and the normal institutions that would be taking care of them, the church, their communities, are now unable to take care of them because we have taken their excess income. And so now the people are not free, they're dependent on the Fed. And the IRS being another police department put in place to bully the American people into submission. And so then this leads to soaking the poor. What does this mean? This means that we must incentivize the poor to depend upon the government as their dad. And so until 1913, the Fed was able to get by with little to no income tax. Afterwards, in order to indoctrinate America into supporting this new authoritarian power, it created new federal departments, such as the Department of Education, the IRS, and infiltrated the universities with socialist ideas. And so the ability to pay doctrine then did not tax the rich because there are more poor folks that can pay. The poor are actually more able to pay than the rich, and they are easier to bully because they have less power. And so the next step was Social Security. This plainly is just a tax. Your money is not saved for you. It is immediately spent, and it is spent by the government and what they want. And now it's going to fail as the US population plummets because there's not enough people to be paying in to the Social Security system. And so all of these old people that are put in so much money, their money's already gone, and they're dependent upon the youth to pay for their retirement. But there's not enough youth because we're going to have a smaller population in the future. Social Security depends on a growing population. And so, along with this, moving to a fiat currency, which is a currency that's based on the trust in the dollar, not in any material. The dollar, it caused the dollar to, inflate, whereas the dollar used to deflate. And so that when you collect Social Security, the dollars you supposedly saved are worth less than when you put them in. And so when the individual is relieved from the obligation of self-respect, the obligation that you have to be a good contributing member of society to take care of the poor, he acquires the habit of helplessness. He is inclined to retreat to the security of the prenatal state, and the more he is taken care of, the more he wants care. And so with the new social safety nets, the new generation sees the US government as its parental guardian. And so then they give up their personal freedom for peace and security. And, to go away from the author, Jesus warns about this. He says, when you hear peace and safety, trouble is at hand. And so in practice, this is a lie because in order to keep funding the social scheme, wars and other crises must be started in order to keep the people reliant on the government as their protector. Um, and so the next chapter is corruption and corruption. So the income tax has caused both corruption of the government and the people. The government is corrupt in that it is both enforcing a law that violates the inalienable right to personal property, being the income tax, but is also enforcing this law. It causes both politicians and the government officials to want more power. And so the people then are corrupted in that by attacking the dignity of the individual at the very base has led to the practice of perjury, fraud, deception, and bribery. Avoidance or evasion of these levies or taxes has become the great American game, and talents of the highest order are employed in the effort to save something from the clutches of the state. People who in their private lives are above reproach will resort to the meanest devices to effect some saving and will even brag of their ingenuity. The necessity of trying to get along under the income tax has made us a corrupt people. And I think that you can see this chiefly in the current political establishment and the people who claim to be trying to fix it, chiefly in Donald Trump and Elon Musk, who have both bragged that they are able to evade the system through loopholes and not breaking the law. They don't break the law at all, but they use the current system to gain more wealth, um, and increase the inequality that's going on in quality of life. So, what's a possible way out? So, the American brand of socialism, known as the New Deal, was made possible by the income tax. So, now that the American government has all of the income that it needs, the New Deal became the catalyst to help in using the Great Depression to create the current situation that we're in. So, our only hope is to plead states' rights. This is the roadblock that our founding fathers put in place. And from here, the book tries to explain that. And so, competition for government. Why does the Fed hate states' rights? And it's because of this. The citizen, and this is a quote from the book, the citizen of divided allegiance cannot be reduced to subservience. If he has a habit of serving two political gods, he cannot be dominated by either one. If the individual has a allegiance to both his church and his local government, then he cannot be dominated by the federal government, of which its only purpose is supposed to be to make sure that the relationships between the states is cordial and that it protects from foreign invaders. And so this is what James Madison says in the Federalist number 45. Powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, but those which remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And this is why the federal government was originally a confederacy, the Articles of Confederation, but we realized that there was too little power given to the federal government. So we created a new federal government that has three branches: the judicial, the executive, and the congressional branch. And this gave enough competition within the government to slow down the onslaught of the quest for more power. Um, our gridlock in our government is on purpose. It is, it is not supposed to be the role of the government to be doing all that it is doing today, but it is the role of the local community and the counties and the states to arbitrate whether that be moral laws to church and state relations to personal individual um, property disputes. Um, it is not supposed to be the federal government's role in doing that, which is why we can't do anything get anything done anymore, is because the federal government was never meant to get things done efficiently. It was meant to get things done slowly in order to curb conquest and power by our politicians. So this is the next chapter. So it was almost as soon as the 16th Amendment was passed, the government started giving out free handouts. And you see this in the New Deal. And so this is from the book. For some years after the amendment went into effect, 7 states of the Union paid in more to the federal government in income taxes than they got back in the form of grants and aid. The other 41 made a profit. Covetousness was thus encouraged, and somehow a Mississippian sees no immorality in enforcing a Pennsylvanian to support his local economy. His pride might stop him from accepting gratuity from his neighbor, but he suffers no such inhibition when he knows it comes from a foreigner. And so this just show, and then today every single state gives more to the Fed than it gets back. And so in essence, you are forcing people who have no interest in what's going on in your in your state. So, for example, you're a Californian citizen, and all of your liberal policies, you are forcing people from Pennsylvania to pay for these policies. And so a sizable amount of Americans are now benefiting from the income tax now through getting these handouts, but are doing it without seeing the ultimate effects it will cause to their grandchildren. And since everybody is benefiting in some way the income tax, the only people that could possibly repeal it is the governors and state legislatures who would need to realize this is wrong. Because why in the world would the masses want to give up these benefits when our people are no longer moral anymore? They would not want to give up the free handouts because it benefits them. But they're taking the capital away from their children. And this book was written in 1954, and we can start to see the ultimate effects now, where a lot of people would say that the baby boomers and have given up their posterity's rights and have given up the future of their children's prosperity for their own self-gratification today and their own security today. And so what we need to do is repeal the 16th Amendment. And this repeal of the 16th Amendment would not be a reform, it would be a revolution. As a result of income taxation, we now have a government with far more power than George III ever exercised. It is self-sufficient, independent of the will of the people. The elections do not alter that fact. These are merely periodic changes of the guard. Whoever is elected retains the power vested in the office as usual and tries to augment it. The end in clear is in clear sight is that the liquidation of all social power and the advent of the regime of absolutism. And how often do you hear this in the modern American political state? So nothing ever happens. From you have Bush to Obama to Biden to Bill Clinton. It's all the same. It's all the same act. Democrats push a little bit more forward. The Republicans slow it down a little bit, but they're the same political entity. They both all have the same goals. One wants to do it more slowly, but one wants to keep going faster. And so this book posits that the citizen is only sovereign when he can retain and enjoy the fruits of his labor. And this book then brings a prophecy, which I believe is what we're about to see. And I think you can see this with Donald Trump's recent argument with Vladimir Zelensky in the White House, which is this: the event that will bring about the complete collapse of freedom in America and the civilization that grew up under it will be the next World War, World War III. The state will, under fear of annihilation from the enemy, confiscate all that remains of social power. And after the war, as usual, it will not give up that power and using it for the general welfare. In short order, even the memory of freedom will have been lost. This is what we already see. There's a minority of an American culture, mostly in the South and in conservatism in general in America, that sees the American government as for what it is. Is mostly blue collar America and the South, and some white collar Americans, but it's mostly our rugged Americans. And uh, what the political establishment has been pushing for has been World War III. Why else would they encourage Ukraine to be part of NATO? Um, we've had a deal with the Soviet Union and now Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed that Ukraine would never join NATO, and the Biden administration pushed for it. And the only reason that you would do that is so that you could gain more power over the people, that you can gain more money from the war, more money from the military industrial complex. And this needs to stop. This needs to stop. And so, in the times of the war for American independence, God raised good men to fight corruption. And in our time, in the right time, according to his will, God will raise certain men to fight tyranny. And so, there is no accounting for the emergence of these superior men, these sports of nature, who sporadically shape the course of mankind. They come, as it were, from nowhere, and nobody has yet conclusively explained their advent. But they come. When, in her own time and her own pleasure, nature deems America ready for and worthy of them, she will give us men who will make the good fight. It seems reasonable to assume that their first objective will be repeal the 16th Amendment. And that is the sentence that concludes the book. So here's some questions that I might posit the author, see, given that he's a secular Jew and I'm a very devout, or I at least try to be Christian. How do we take care of the poor without the income tax? And I think what he would say is that we must encourage giving to the local religious institutions and charity. What is a tangible step towards repealing the 16th? And it's try not your best to use social handouts. And then be advocating and petitioning your local congressmen and your governors to hold a constitutional convention and repeal the 16th by amending the Constitution. And it's 2025, and his book was written in 1954. Can we still fix this? And I said, this is what I think he would say. It's much harder now. We're really far along the path. But if we promote rugged individualism, family values, and good citizenship, we pull the culture back to the moral requirements necessary for a republic. And I think that answer is lacking, but I think that's how he would define that. So here's my analysis. I believe where this falls short is that rugged individualism is not why America was successful. What made America successful was her Christianity. America recognizes the sovereignty of the individual, yes, but also the individual's dependence upon community, state, nation, and ultimately the church under God. And this is why the American founding fathers were not anarchists and they did not believe in democracy, but they knew that the individual does depend upon government. But that government must be good and be a moral good, and that the people must be a moral good for this to succeed. And this is the United States Supreme Court, and this is the mid 1800s, said in Holy Trinity versus the United States, these are in many other matters which might be noticed, add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances, that this is a Christian nation. So the United States Supreme Court has ruled that America is a Christian nation. There is the precedence for this. And so in order for America to become a moral nation again, we must recognize that the Judeo-Christian values don't exist. There is no way that we can mix the different religious values of Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Confucianists, but that they all have their totality in Christianity and the divine Logos, the Word of God, Jesus Christ, and that he is the Lord and he has ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of God the Father and is ruling over the universe right now. And so the only perfect morality that exists is that of Christ and his religion. And we must recognize that Christ is king over the United States. This is not necessarily to support Christian nationalism, but it is to recognize the objective truth that Christianity is the only real and true religion, And this is perfect freedom. And this also does not violate the First Amendment because this is not establishing a state church. This is only recognizing that Christianity is objectively true, that Christ died and rose again from the dead, is a historic reality and not a figment of the American imagination. And so we're 71 years after the publishing of this book. This book has predicted, I believe, everything that has happened over the course of that time. And the current post war establishment is vying for power, but it has no boogeyman since the Soviet Union fell. And we are in real danger of American freedoms falling. And that if America does not return to these three key principles, which is one, Christian primacy with religious toleration, that we recognize Christ as king and that is an objective reality, but it requires the Holy Spirit to convict the hearts. And so it is a necessary evil that we allow certain religions to be tolerated within America and religious freedom, but that we only tolerate that American or that Christianity is true, that Christ is king. And the Monroe Doctrine, we return to the Monroe Doctrine that we must return to a tariff-based system, and that America is the sovereign of the Western Hemisphere. In that we are the moral good for the Western Hemisphere, and let Europe do what it does with Europe. Let Europe do what it does with Europe, and that we are not going to be the sheriffs of the world. That we will have good relationships with Europe, but only in as much as they're upholding Christian values. And that we will return to a respect of personal property by abolishing the income tax and other taxes that invade our inalienable rights given to us by God. How does this apply to our personal finances and how we make decisions in our lives? Well, we must make sacrifices in order to return to the original intent of the founders of this country, which means try not to take these social handouts. And this is easier said than done, I know. But rely upon our families and our communities and be active in church. And so the best way we can use our finances is to be good Christians with our finances. Give to those in need, give to the church, invest primarily not in foreign missions that churches elsewhere have an obligation to take care of, but use the Ordo Salutis that we are limited in our scope and that we have an obligation to take care of the man that is next to us, the poor that are right down the street. And fund missions to secular and pagan America. That 50% of America is pagan. We're not a Christian country anymore, by and large. And we need to stop sending missionaries primarily to Africa and Asia when I know that even in the Anglican churches that Africa is sending missionaries to America because they know we're a pagan country. And so what does this mean is that we need more church plants. We need to finance and invest our capital, whatever else we have left after taxes, to one, planting new traditional churches in America, but also taking back traditional institutions such as Princeton and Harvard, which were training our pastors, and to kick out the socialists and the communists who are inherently anti-Christ and anti-America. We need to return to a traditional American values and traditional American Christianity, which is chiefly found, one, in the Anglican Church, two, in Lutheran, Reformed, Methodist, and Baptist churches. And we need to return to biblical worship, biblical ways of understanding Christianity, and traditional ways of understanding Christianity, which Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians, which is that we are to hold to the oral and written traditions under the scriptures. And so if you want any further resources on this, I think looking to The Southern Tradition at Bay by Richard Weaver, Progress and Poverty by Henry George, Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke, and the Cold War and the Income Tax. And thank you. That's my presentation.